Welcome, listeners, to Streams of Resistance, a special series by the Wayward Wanderer, where we find out more about the far right and what people are doing about it, from the folks who are in the thick of it. In this episode, we will be finding out more about the fraught relationship between law enforcement and far-right ideologies.
Pagan campground for anyone within the pagan movement who shares inclusive values. And I also work for the government of Canada. That's the federal government. And I've worked as a criminologist basically since the start of my career. So for almost 20 years, I've worked as a criminologist for the federal government. I have an undergraduate degree in anthropology and history. And I did two honors theses for that degree. One of them was on the similarities between police subcultures and outlaw biker subcultures. And the other one was on the how the legal system dealt with a hate phone line that was put up in the 70s. This was before, of course, the internet. So this was one of the only places you could possibly get hate information at that time. And then I did my master's degree in anthropology, but that was on a different subject. It was on ethnogenesis in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And but I learned a lot about identity and ethnicity doing that kind of work. And then more recently, I've taken a leave of absence from my work with the government and gone and started to pursue a PhD in criminology and social justice. And my topic there is, of course, the overlap between right-wing extremism and heathenry. And specifically, I'm interested in making comments about the Canadian situation, but North America, in Canada and the US, we tend to have fairly closely aligned social movements. And so we often get what the Americans have, just in a slightly different way. We don't usually have an entirely different trend, but it usually is just a slightly different sort of spin on things, right? Yeah, and that's basically my background. And at Ravens Knoll, of course, I've been a Gothi there since the start. My initial heathen community was the faction of the Troth that split off with Prudence Priest shortly. So that was one of the inclusive factions that was a little bit less about organization, a bit more about sort of anarchic sort of organizing, self-organizing, rather than top-down organizing. So there were a couple of different inclusive factions that split off when the Troth broke up after the racism controversies in the 80s. And there were two different racist groups that broke off too. The inclusive group that Prudence is part of, who I haven't talked to for a long time, but anyways, it was called the American Vinland Association. So with Gamlingen, I think he's from New Mexico or Arizona, Prudence, and the main Canadian was Andy Biggers. And Andy Biggers is my friend, and he's the one who initially I took my oaths from. So that's essentially my historical background. I'm really, really involved with paganism generally because I'm one of the organizers for the Kaleidoscope Gathering, which is Canada's largest pagan festival. And the reason why we can have Ravens Knoll as a community center for the pagan traditions in Canada is because the money from the Kaleidoscope Gathering goes to fund that sacred space location. Yeah, so those are my backgrounds. So I have both a professional interest, a scholarly interest, and a personal spiritual interest in this subject matter.
What first sparked your awareness of the far right in law enforcement being a significant trend?
Well, that's interesting because that probably when I was in grade 10. And I'm from Ottawa, and I'm of an age that I have spanned a couple of different interesting eras. So in the late 80s and early 90s in Ottawa, there is in a lot of cities, there's a neo-Nazi skinhead scene. And it was really big during the 80s. But we also had a really huge sharp scene in Ottawa, which is skinheads against racial prejudice. And basically Ottawa had roughly even numbers of both. I was not a skinhead, although at the time I was basically a jock. I had a shaved head. I did martial arts. I dressed like a hippie, but I hung out with punks. So it was a bit of a confusing subcultural group. But I got skinheads tried to recruit me a couple different times. And I was and we used to all go to the same gigs. So it was like 6 bands, $6 kind of thing. And like every skinhead and punk in Ottawa would sort of attend. And police would be at these venues, and people would be handing out their zines. So you'd have the straight edge socialist punks handing out their zines, shouting at the cops and each other and the racist skinheads. Then you have the racist skinheads with their zines shouting at the cops and the punks, and etc. So, and then you have the police trying to contain the situation outside of every gig, right? So my understanding was also too is like what you see the police officers get more upset about, right? So the punks are like, oh, they're getting more upset that we're blaspheming Jesus to get a rise out of you, and you take that down faster than you take down the support for Holocaust denial, right? And so you see those kinds of like immediate reactions from police officers where they have a chance. There's posters like on light poles beside them. And they could choose to walk over to the Holocaust denial one and rip it down, or they could choose to walk over to the Jesus is a piece of shit one or whatever and rip that one down. And they chose the more left-wing topics to rip down first whenever that sort of occurred in those sort of conflicts. And so it was at that point when I realized, first of all, that there are still people around who want to commit a Holocaust, which I didn't sort of really like. The school system had not prepared me for that, right? At least where I was. So that's when I first became aware of those biases and those problems, and the fact that it wasn't universal either. It was just like, it wasn't every police officer who was there, just one guy out of the group, right? Or something along those lines. So that's the environment I grew up in. And in fact, one of those same skinheads who was at the same gigs I went to, he joined the military, and he became part of the Airborne, the Canadian Airborne, in the early 90s. And then the Canadian Airborne went over to Somalia, and they committed war crimes there and hate crimes. They murdered a young teenager and committed a number of other atrocities in Somalia. And there was a review. There was a review when they came back, and some people got sentences, but not nearly enough as they should have. But one of the main individuals who was in that airborne unit, that skinhead dude, he had to leave the military, and he did some time. But then he joined and helped form Blood and Honor in Canada, which Blood and Honor, for those who aren't familiar, is a right-wing extremist group tied to skinhead scenes, Combat 18, and etc. And so he became part of that, and that was our first listed terrorist entity on the right wing in Canada. It's the longest listed one. And the members, and in turn, not him, but members of Blood and Honor then formed an Assateague Kindred in British Columbia, in Vancouver. So you can see here, this is a military connection, not law enforcement, but they're very similar. Military and law enforcement, there's similar types of issues. They're not identical, but they can be similar. So for this example, you see a dude who went from being a racist teenager, probably with, chauvinist parents, became a racist teenager, then joined the military, infected that military unit, then left the military and is still committed to ideological hate, right? And then you can see at the very end how the milieu of the sort of right-wing extremist milieu, the skinhead milieu, military milieu, connects directly to some heathen, at least one heathen kindred in Canada, probably more. Yeah.
How do far-right elements gain entry into law enforcement agencies in particular?
Yeah. So this is a question that has to be totally reframed because it assumes a particular social context and process by which these things occur, right? So it assumes that you have, see, one of the things is like we have to think of why people join police services and law enforcement in the first place, okay? And so and come a lot of the listeners, yourself, people will be on the other side, so they will have a different cultural viewpoint of police. This isn't your viewpoint; it's what they believe they are doing. Right? That's what anthropology is all about. It's about culture, belief, and the symbols that the people hold true. And so, one of the things is that police and law enforcement is essentially a masculine way of being a civil servant for people who are in blue collar and less and poorer backgrounds, right? So you have this sort of blue collar idea that a good thing for women is nursing, and a good thing for men is law enforcement or being a first responder of some kind or something. Like these are ideas on how you can make it as a good citizen from being a blue collar person, right? And this way but the thing is, because you're providing this intimate local service, it doesn't really feel like you're working for the big government, those policies, right? However, what they do feel like they're doing is they are being guardians of society, right? Like the job of a law enforcement officer and the military is to guard society. Their job is to commit moral violence, right? That's their job description, right? Like when push comes to shove, when we've tried everything else, they are the people who we let commit moral violence. And so people who want to commit moral violence on behalf of others, in other words, to do policing, want to join the police and the military, right? And and it was really interesting. There was a retired police officer who was one of the members of the January 6th coup, right? The coup attempt, and of course there had just been all this sort of blue lives matter, Black Lives Matter stuff right beforehand, right? Like less than a year beforehand, and yet this individual. He's fighting a police officer to get into. Fighting someone who's a law enforcement officer to get into the building because he thinks his interpretation of the law is correct, right? And what he said was, it's so ironic that ex-police officers were attacking police officers who were on duty at that situation. But the reason is this is a quote from him. He says, "I felt like I was the cop and he was the protester," right? So you have to think their actions, because of the way that they're brought up and the way that you learn your job, you become part of an elite warrior subculture, right? What you're doing is a noble cause. Your organization is a noble cause. And if you are thwarted in any way, then they are immoral because your noble cause is being halted and stopped, right? In the United States, you have a very particular ideology that comes from your country being founded by terrorists, like revolutionaries. So remember, terrorists and revolutionaries are the same thing, right? You have to think about this. They're the same thing. Terrorists just don't win. Revolutionaries do, right? So you have in the United States this idea, the posse comitatus and so on, this idea of this constitutional sheriff ideology. And this ideology, it was part of Jacksonian, sort of democracy and like the know-nothings and all that shit. So in the 1800s, which has kind of come back, but it really began in the modern times in opposition to desegregation in the American South, right? And so the idea is that sheriffs, because they are elected, which they aren't in Canada, right? So this is why we Canadians find this insane. So this ideology quite often, although there are many Canadians who believe this now because of the right-wing extremist discourses, etc. Anyways, the idea is that sheriffs can disregard laws if they don't feel that it follows the Constitution, or if the vast majority of people in their jurisdiction do not agree that the law is moral, right? In one survey of American sheriffs that I found by academics, 50% of the sheriffs surveyed believed in the constitutional sheriff ideology to some degree. And 33% of the sheriffs who responded said that in the future, sheriffs may need to use force to defend the American way of life. which is essentially the use of moral violence against the civilian population according to your ideological beliefs, correct? Right? That's essentially the subtext of what that said, but without that bluntness. And 11%, or about 1 in 10 of the sheriffs who were interviewed, supported the Oath Keepers directly. And the Oath Keepers are a right-wing extremist group that essentially their core belief system is derived from this ideology, right? It overlaps heavily. And 50% of the sheriffs surveyed in that survey believed that the far left, to some degree or another, was behind the January 6th coup, which is absolutely bonkers, and it's just talking points from the right wing.
Well,
And
for
so,
one, if it was the far left, they wouldn't have been live streaming themselves without masks on committing crimes. I mean,
no, yeah, of course, because we all know the far left wear masks, right? Like, so. Yeah, no, well, the thing is, then the far right wear, what is it, those like little sock things that you bring up over your face?
yeah, the gaiters.
Yeah, that's right. The neck gaiters. The neck gaiters seem to be the right wing accoutrement of, anyways. And so you have to think that both police officers and military, they're joining because they are patriotic. They believe in their country. They believe in the society that they're a part of, and they want to do something good. However, they may have a very different view of what that society they're defending is than someone else, because almost everybody just thinks about their own loved ones. They're like, oh, I'm a Canadian. I love my friends and family. Therefore, I love Canada. But the thing is, you can be a left-wing person and love your friends and family and love Canada for the same reason, because, oh, I have all these multicultural friends and family. I believe in cultural exchange under one national banner, right, which is Canadian national ideology. Well, where was I here? Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Sorry.
That's all right.
I do this every now and then. I get kind of I get rolling and I get kind of tired. I got Lyme disease, so I get brain fog every now and then, especially if I'm presenting. But
Oof.
So you have to just get me back on course. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Just note the time real quick.
Oh yeah, another thing, the thing I should mention too is that this is a fairly recent trend too. Okay, so if you're looking at problems with people with a military background, so this is right-wing extremists with a military background. Okay, not law enforcement background. There hasn't been as much work done on that. More has been done on military background. But anyways, in the U.S. in 2018. Less than 1% of the right-wing extremist attacks were committed by people with a military background. But by 2019, that had risen to 1.5%, and by 2020, 6.5%. Obviously, January 6th really increased those numbers, but these are the American numbers, right? So this is only in the U.S. And in Canada, we have had an increase of hate crimes. For instance, 2020 is the most recent year of reporting, and that's the highest number of hate crimes we've ever had. Now, one of my main jobs in government when I first got there was I managed the hate crime file for Justice Canada. So I did hate crime research, and one of our main jobs was to get these hate crime statistics working, right? There's still problems with collecting hate crime statistics. There's still problems with police categorization, all these kinds of issues. But Canada, basically, we were able to lead the way in the early 2000s with the development of hate crime statistics. And that's really important to have them and to make sure that they get better and better, because we have to be able to name the problem that we're trying to deal with. Whether it is in the military, whether it's in civilian society, or whether in law enforcement. So that's an important thing to mention. Now, when you're talking also too about this specifically military problems in the military that I've just noted have been on the increase lately, right? This has increased most in the United States, but it also is in Germany as well. Germany and the United States are fairly similar in the inroads that right-wing extremists have made into the military and how much it affects the ideology with soldiers. There have been a number of incidents of right-wing extremist symbols, etc., like songs and Nazi salutes, etc., in countries like Spain, Romania, a few other areas, some NATO member like the Netherlands. But in most of those cases, they get reprimanded fairly well, and they are a little bit more like outliers. really the US and Germany are probably the worst. Canada has some as well. I've got a bunch of different examples from Canada that I can give. But really the military in US and Germany are probably, they have the worst problems. Canada does have it. So for instance, one of the reasons that there's an overlap between the military and right-wing extremism is because the worry is that military members themselves will commit right-wing extremist acts, right? And if they're there, like I mentioned with the Somalia incident and murders. But we also have things like, we had a reservist in Canada named Curran, and he drove to our Governor General's residence in Ottawa with weapons like long guns and rifles, and I don't know if he had other kinds of munitions. But he wanted to arrest the Prime Minister for treason. Right?
Okay.
This was during COVID, right? But luckily he was stopped by our law enforcement services and talked down before he could do something, right? So luckily we stopped the shooting and the possible assassination by there. We also have incidents of another reservist, Patrick Matthews, organizing training camps for the base, Atomwaffen, etc. So he had connections there. He eventually moved to the US and got arrested for producing DMT with a whole bunch of other Atomwaffen guys. I think it was in New York State. But so he's an example of someone who was a real hardcore activist, and he actually changed his life. Basically went underground and on the run as a criminal terrorist, right? So we have those kinds of examples as well. And Matthews, he used propaganda developed by Dark Foreigner, who has also been uncovered recently. Dark Foreigner happens to be from Ottawa too, and he's the person who developed the TerraCore aesthetic with the spray and stuff like that. So he's from Ottawa, and most of his I've taken a look at a lot of his propaganda that's not necessarily available to everybody, and it uses all themes from esoteric Hitlerism and Ariosophy. So he uses Guido von List's runes, for instance, some of the older stuff, and especially sort of the concepts coming from Sugerno and Satri Devi, for instance. Even though Satri Devi, she was not a heathen, a lot of the concepts from sort of the Aryan Hinduism and Theosophy and so on that she believed in, got incorporated into a lot of the sort of the heathen mid-century right-wing extremism. And when I'm saying mid-century, that's at the time period when heathenism, right-wing extremist heathenry, was essentially given a facade of science fiction, so that it could seem like sort of it could hide in plain sight, really, right? Because it was just so crazy that it couldn't get eliminated, right? So it's basically, and that's where we get our modern Thor comic book mythos, right? It's from that same time period, and that's a whole other issue. But yeah, so that's an example. Then there's another way that their overlap can happen is by facilitating extremist violence by other organizations. So, for instance, if you have a response by a law enforcement agency or military even, and they come up, and then the issue they're dealing with is one that they also share. They share an agreement with their narrative for some reason. The policing that becomes much harder because they will assess it at a low level of risk, right? And then the response will be different because it's not risky for them because their identities are the same, right? So you actually have these kinds of issues, and so then you get issues with, for instance, like Proud Boy recruitment, right? Will maybe happen adjacent to law enforcement or military activities, especially the social activities, right? And because there's overlap, so it could be overlap of membership, etc. And then when they come up against those organizations, when they're actually investigating them or policing them, they're more likely to assess the risks incorrectly, right? Let's see here. I already mentioned the problem with committing war crimes or hate crimes, right? If you have people who have those beliefs in a policing or a military organization. A huge issue too is it screws up the ability to have a diverse military or police service, because if you're a person of color or a person who these right-wing extremists hate, you think it's going to be comfortable being in the military unit with them? Because military and law enforcement all are about hierarchy and rank, right? So there's lots of bullying and hazing, and it's part of the culture because you have to establish rank hierarchy in kind of a confrontational way. So this is a social way that the organizations are put together, right? Now, just by having that kind of attitude, right, being politically incorrect, making those kinds of jokes, you make the whole job environment uncomfortable for everybody else. And because you cannot fight, you cannot speak back against it the same way you can in other organizations, because of the hierarchical nature of the organization. You can have the more senior ranks you have with problems, the more it spreads to the entire organization. So one of your main issues for fighting racism in the ranks is getting rid of people who tolerate it within the executive structure or the senior management structure. It's huge, because what that allows is for all of those silences that happen below them to be unsilenced, right? Because in law enforcement and in military, you can be trained all the fuck you want. You go to training, cultural sensitivity, whatever. But what you actually believe in your self-concept at the end of the day about who you are as a military member or who you are as a law enforcement member, it's related to what sociologists often call, or psychologists call, a reference group or a reference point. And that will be an individual or an archetype of the prime person. Like, who is the most policey police officer? You want to be a police officer, even outside of the police, we know it's a thin blue line police officer. It's a police officer who protects his fellow officers, even if they were doing something that's sort of questionable, right? Because we could try to reform him later on. Maybe he's not all that bad. They did all this other good stuff, all this kind of stuff. And people just do that naturally. And so we had examples, for instance, Fire Force Ventures. They were in Canada. They were regular duty officer. No, not officers. I don't know if they were regular members, but some of them were reservists and some of them were regular duty. And they had this business where they sold Rhodesian and South African military memorabilia, and basically just for racist purposes. And also, any of these symbols, even though they're really low key, most people wouldn't understand them, because it requires a bit of history and knowledge of the area to understand what they mean. They're all about racism and killing your hated enemy, right? And so these kind of low key symbols are also all through the military and references. And so, this is not something your senior ranks may even notice, but eventually this was noticed and it was done away with. There's also something I kind of mentioned is there's not just military and law enforcement, but we have an issue of mercenaries nowadays. If you think about it, the mercenary scene is mainly right-wing extremists. Okay, so the people who are doing these things, going around and being mercenaries, there's not a lot of left-wing mercenaries in the sort of this, for hire killing in another country kind of job. And you even have examples like for instance, Steve McNallen, right? He radicalized a little bit because he was a writer for Soldier of Fortune magazine, right? And a lot of his ads for the AFA initially were in Soldier of Fortune magazine, right? So you have this, you even have an initial early nucleus for the racist heathen right that emerged from mercenary culture. And where were the mercenaries going in the 70s? Well, guess what? They were going to South Africa and Namibia and Angola and stuff. So I don't know if any of the Fire Force Ventures dudes were heathen, but it could be possible, because that's one of the nexus of right-wing extremism, violence, and heathenry, right, that we have. Then there's another issue too, is that you undermine the civilian control of those organizations, right? So this is where you get into the idea of sort of fascism, military coup, those kinds of ideas. So And the whole concept of the constitutional sheriff idea is basically an ideological reason for not subordinating yourself to civilian control, right? The military in democratic societies, the military has to be subordinate to civilian control, as do law enforcement, right? Because in a democracy, it's your elected officials who are supposed to tell them when they're supposed to commit moral violence or not. They're not supposed to decide when to commit moral violence. But the more you work in an organization, who wants someone else outside of their organization or even outside of their own work unit to tell them what to do? No one likes that, right? So over time, the organization can just get frustrated with the types of control that people are trying to put on it, and then because of that, become insular and become more of an echo chamber. And that's what often occurs with people who are trying to fix these problems with training. Go to cultural training, go to whatever training. Well, training just makes these individuals more bitter and more extreme, right? And so if training doesn't do it, from my perspective, the kind of thing that would do it better would be like with organized crime. I used to manage organized crime research too. So the cops, okay, so for racial profiling, right? If you got a cop, two different cops, okay? One cop works with gang members daily, contacts them, helps them with programs, does all that kind of stuff. So they're basically the gang unit. Basically, they go to the gang members and just check in with them and say hello, basically, all the time. And then they find out from them who's destabilizing the gang system, and then they focus on them so that there's a reduction in violence, right? Like that's basically gang policing. They're making friends, so to speak, with gangsters so that they can get intelligence and so that they don't necessarily take down all gangsters. They just take down the ones that are destabilizing the drug markets and causing violence, right? Now, and then you have your other just regular officers who are driving around, filling out paperwork, responding to calls, whatever. They go anywhere, okay? Now, if you take those individuals and you put them against a black teenager, well, what someone has looked at is how delinquent that black teenager is. So some black teenagers obviously are criminals, and they have committed criminal acts, and they may even have drugs on them or something illegal on them, right? Legal firearm. And so they'd be at 100%. And so both the street cop and the organized crime cop can figure out who that guy is. So they will stop him and so on. However, but if you go down, for instance, to someone who has never committed a crime, is totally a law-abiding dude, the gang officer is pretty good at telling who that is. Most of the time, they'll be like, "Oh, we don't need to stop that guy. He's not a gang member," right? But the patrol officer is way fucking shittier at doing it, even if they are the same ethnicity as the person they're stopping, right? Even if they're a black officer, it doesn't matter if they're black or white officer. The same pattern holds. They're just a little bit better at doing it, right? It's still the same pattern, and it's because they understand the subculture of crime. And they understand the motivations for crime at that exact point in time and in that social context, which is all tied up with the identities of the people who are there, right? And so that's how you get people doing it, by interacting with people who are from another culture or group, whether within their own units, but also in the types of jobs and work that they do, right? It's lived experience that changes people's minds, not like job training. And that's why a lot of these problems are very difficult to deal with, because first of all, you have to chop off a bunch of senior managers, and then you have to try to rearrange work in such a way that you help people become better individuals, better law enforcement, better military members, right? And one of the problems with now that we have civilian control, two of these organizations, is they deal with their problems like civilians deal with their problems, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a double-edged sword. So civilians are like, in our organizations, like civil service, you fuck up, there could be something in your life, you have an addiction issue, whatever. Unless it's completely horribly egregious, usually things are some sort of shade of gray. And so you give someone the benefit of the doubt, and then you try to rehabilitate them, right? And this happens the first or second offense, right? And from an outsider's point of view, but with the information that they know, it looks like, holy shit, they're letting neo-Nazis stay in the military, But if the military wanted to act like a military, what they do is they take that person out and shoot them. That's what they do during a war. But because they are a civilian military in a democratic nation, we deal with the problems in a democratic manner as well, right? And because of privacy concerns, it looks way, way worse from the outside than sometimes from the inside. But maybe we shouldn't be trying to rehabilitate anyone either, right? We made these same arguments when it was the other way around in the 60s and 70s. Like Canada had, was persecuting gay members of law enforcement and the military. We had something called the fruit machine here. You can look that up. It's an interesting story. And the same kinds of processes were in play with the military and law enforcement during the 60s and 70s, but with the left wing. So there were left-wing radicals. They had issues with left wing, et cetera. Now they're trying to figure out the same thing with the right wing. But the right wing, they are not, like I mentioned, since their cultures are similar and the narratives are similar and the way that they assess threats is similar. They don't see it as a risk because the cultural difference between them is not as great. So they don't think it's as scary, right? Is essentially it.
Sorry. So looping back particularly to what you were talking about with the problem of senior management being a significant factor in enabling the far right within law enforcement. On the flip side, is there any kind of significant rank and file opposition that exists within law enforcement, like by law enforcement officers towards known or potential like far right extremists within their organizations?
Yeah, this is not something that is done on an institutional level. It's just individual people, right? Mm-hmm. So it's individual people's political stances and things like that, more or less. So, but the problem, that can be a huge issue though, especially if there's enough people. So for instance, we're having our Freedom Convoy 2 now in Ottawa. It's disorganized compared to last time, but last winter we had what was called the Freedom Convoy, and it was all over the world. And people started to use that as a reference point and copycat what our Canadian extremists and right-wing politicians were doing, right? And with this Freedom Convoy, and it was a bit of a shit show with the way that it was responded to by law enforcement services, and that's why it lasted so long and became such a problem, because they let big rigs park downtown, essentially, which are essentially homes / bombs / staging areas, and they were all over the place, right downtown. And so the first issue is that tactical problem, but there's a whole bunch of other issues. But one of the things that the inquiry into this Freedom Convoy discovered was that every single police service that dealt with the convoy leaked information to convoy members. Someone. So but we don't know exactly, at what level it was, to what degree. Some of it was strategic information, some of it was tactical, some of it might have been accidental, some of it might have been on purpose, right? But the thing is, what that means is that CSIS, that's like our secret service, like our CIA, like our bit more like an FBI, I guess. Yeah, more like an FBI. The RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who's our federal police service, and they police several provinces as well. The Ottawa Police Service, which is the municipal police service in Ottawa. And who else was there? I think that was it. There was no military police on site or leaking information that I heard of. That's the only police service involved with the Freedom Convoy that didn't leak information to them. And we had the same problem on January 6th for the January 6th coup, right? So you have information going back and forth. You have a few law enforcement officers helping out with the protesters. One of the big problematic things is police are supposed to be friendly to protesters, right? So what police do is that they form a very unfriendly mass position, and then when police are out individually, they're friendly, because police need intelligence and they need good relationships with the protest crowd in order to manage the protest and in order to have intelligence about problems, about risk, right? So police always take smiley pictures with members of the public, right? Problem is that the right wing uses smiley pictures of the police with left-wing people and trans people and so on against them. And left-wing people use pictures of the police with right-wing people against them, right? So some of the pictures, yes, some of the pictures and some of the interactions are intentionally friendly just because they don't consider it a risk to take a picture with this person. Maybe because they don't understand. But, you know, quite often they know just who it is, but they're smiling, right? So you'll get the same officer taking a picture with a Ku Klux Klan member as with a Nation of Islam person, right? And they're both smiling and stuff, but they're going to be used for very different propaganda purposes by different groups, right? But so that could be an issue. One of the most dangerous places, actually, I think, for violence to erupt is during protests. In fact, and this is because a lot of the right-wing extremist groups believe that they are doing the policing that police are not allowed to do, right? So they believe that they are supporting society, their vision of society, and a good society that that the police would support if they're allowed to say it publicly, right? So if you're at a protest and there's these people like soldiers, so for instance, Soldiers of Odin, right, are an example of this kind of group that does public policing on, you know, that they believe the police can't do. And the 3%ers do this as well. Sometimes Oath Keepers too. So they show up at whatever right-wing event, and then they'll be here. Oh, we're here to keep the peace. So essentially, what they're saying is that if the police cannot commit moral violence because they are being stopped for ideological reasons, like the left has stopped them or something, then we are the ones who will step in and be the police, right? And so this is the mindset that they have. And so what this means is that protests can flip on an edge really, really quickly into violence. And so it's extremely dangerous. What we don't have is a policing group on the left as much. Now, because the left knows that it isn't part of the social hegemony. So it's protest. It is legitimately protesting. Now, right-wing protests are a bit different because right-wing protests are about not trying to change what the state's doing, but trying to get the state to do what they think it already is doing, which it isn't. Right? So it's a really different sort of perspective when you get to a protest site, because it has to do with, like, you have to consider extremism. You have to judge. It's important for us to understand what how the person thinks they relate to normality within their society, right? Right-wing extremists, even though they may be marginal subcultures, they still believe that the moral violence that they are committing is moral violence that is supported by their society around them. If not far and wide, at least in the areas where they have the social context in which they've committed their violence, right? Yeah. So so that's an important one. Oh, the one point I haven't gotten to is training, which is also a really interesting one. And this is a huge one in the States where most of the Oath Keepers are, and a lot of these right-wing extremists, people in the militia movement, etc. They're ex-military or ex-law enforcement, and right-wing extremists who aren't military or law enforcement idolize these people because they are the ones who used to be allowed to commit moral violence, but now since they're out, they can say whatever they want and say their personal beliefs, right? And so they usually get promoted really, really fast through organizations because they have high status amongst right-wing extremists, because right-wing extremists want what they have, right? They want respectability. They want a hero status of a law enforcement or police officer. They want to be part of a warrior society, right? And they want to be a hero for their society, so patriotic, right? And so you have this sort of milieu of warfare trainers who are ex law enforcement or police, but you also have people who are professional, non-state professional warfare trainers. These people are often mercenaries. So this is where you have the overlap between the mercenary community and warfare training and civilian warfare training people, right? Because it isn't another. Oftentimes, when law enforcement, or not usually military, but usually law enforcement get trainers, they aren't serving police officers, and they're not serving military. They're getting their violence training from this milieu of retired and mercenary individuals, essentially, right? And what they do is that they make the people who are their training hypersensitive to certain kinds of threat, and hypersensitive to certain kinds of responses to threat situations, right? And we know cognitively that people experience emotion before they experience rationality. So no matter how rational or how trained you're trying to be, what they're actually doing is training the person to respond to their emotional state really, really quickly. And if you are a non-racist, even if you think you're not a racist person, you still have all the stereotypes that society has programmed you with, and you're still going to respond emotionally. Your emotions may not be as strong or the exact same as the right-wing extremist, but there's still an emotional reaction. And so the very training process for use of force in a lot of police and military, it helps to increase the possibility for right-wing extremist violence, just because of the way people, just because of social psychology, really. Let's see. And then some people, obviously, they join organizations, right? So you have this skinhead who joined the military because he wanted to gain violence skills and go to other countries and kill people who he hated, right? But you also get people joining law enforcement. Like, for instance, there were two law enforcement officers in Virginia who were members of the AFA, and they were also members of a Theodish, a right-wing extremist Theodish group. And they lost their jobs because of their AFA affiliations, right? But they became police officers essentially during the time of Black Lives Matter and the Trump run-up, right? So one of the reasons they may want to join the police service in Virginia is because they want to reinstate order, the order of their traditional society in Virginia, right? And what are they? But then they realize, oh, the Christians aren't necessarily on side with them all the time, and a lot of the churches are black churches. So hey, let's try this heathenry thing out, right? So for those individuals, heathenry came along with their rising right-wing extremism as well as their warrior persona. So it's not like it's one thing or the other. They're overlapping trends, and it's not like it's. We have to think of these things more of like social movements rather than as like spy campaigns, right? So it's not like the Proud Boys are sitting in a room and then, they're like, okay, you were a secret cell. You were going to live here for 5 years, and then, you're going to do what you do. No, it's more like, it's a lot more like a club. Like people do not have the socioeconomic connections to the organization for it to control their lives that greatly. And that's the one advantage we have about right-wing extremism, is that it's insanely fractured, right? There's so many different groups, and none of the organizations can really tell their members to do anything. It's all about getting a little tiny group of people who are already radicalized to move them to action somehow. Sometimes it's an outside force, sometimes it's someone within the group. And that's the main way that right-wing extremist actions have been taking place. It hasn't been to any sort of strategic, it's not actually all that strategic. It just pops up out of a whole bunch of different little angry milieu of these people, right-wing extremists who believe they have a warrior identity. And they have decided that now is the point where they must police society. Right.
As one last one to finish with, what do you expect to see from far-right law enforcement, connected elements in this coming year, especially given that we've seen things like the defeat of the Reichsbürger plot in Germany, the actions that were taken by certain police in the recent storming of the federal buildings in Brasilia, as part of that like whole Bolsonaro version of January 6th and January 6th itself.
Yeah, one of the
But
interesting things about the Brazilian January 6th, I'll just call it that, like it's obviously got its own name, but they also had a minister who was involved with some of the protesters and the coup attempts. So although Bolsonaro in the U.S. it was Trump, the president, but in Brazil it was a minister because Bolsonaro had already fled to Florida before this had taken place because he was worried about criminal charges from Lula's government, right? So. But that's the same. So Bolsonaro obviously is an ex-military officer. They had a right-wing extremist government, military junta in Brazil for many, many years. So the culture of of a military coup is much more likely even in Brazil than in the United States, which hasn't had a military. Although the United States is a militarized country, even though it's a democracy. So the U.S. is a military state. Obviously, you spend 1/3 of the world's budget of the military is spent by the United States, right? So it's a military country, even though it's a democracy. A lot of other democratic countries aren't nearly as militarized as the United States. I don't know where it's going with that, but it sort of got in my head. Sorry, yeah. So you were saying about Bolsonaro. Now in the future, what I know is taking place now in Canada is there's Dr. Perry, who's my thesis supervisor. She has it's called a SHIRK grant. It's kind of social science research grant in Canada. And they've been doing over the last 2 years a lot of research on Canada's military with the military. And so Canada's military brass is on board with changes in multiculturalism. The problem is that a lot of that same not the political level, but some of the top ranks military level, a lot of them have problems with sexual assault and sexual misconduct in their past. And the Canadian military has had a huge issue with this, same with the RCMP. So both the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the military have really tried to get at their sexual misconduct issues, right? So this has been a huge issue. And then immediately following, and then you see some of the senior members, start the allegations, and some of them charged, some of them being removed, etc. So that's the situation you have when right-wing extremism suddenly started to shoot up as an issue, right? And the issues are tied because hypermasculinity and warrior codes, warrior ethos, reference groups, that's one of the problems for sexual misconduct too, right? Sexual assault in the military. A lot of the same kinds of attitudes and also the same individuals with the same identities are the ones committing both crimes, right? Offenses against your fellow officer. If you're trying to make your job environment difficult for women and gay people, well, maybe you're also trying to make it difficult for, Black and Muslim people in the law enforcement or military. So some of these issues have to be dealt with hand in hand. And what I see is that there's a massive political will to deal with this, whether or not but the problem is both organizations have been given power to look at it themselves. So they are both trying to do it themselves now, with outside help from academics and so on. But I don't know to what degree it will improve in the future. But I do know that the Canadian military and police services have looked to the United States and seen how scary January 6th was. And a lot of them have also seen how Freedom Convoy people have behaved, which is our version of the January 6th event, but never turned into a storming of Parliament. But it was, we were worried about it. Yeah, so. Well, one thing I'd like to talk about a little bit about is, I think heathen theology is really, really important because I don't think we've really discussed enough how to move out of the blood, sort of some of these blood and soil and archetypal ideas, because the whole concept of archetypes is all over paganism, and it's derived directly from Jung, and his theory of archetypes is racist as fuck. Right? The collective unconscious is supposedly something that occurs within human cultural groups that is determined because of their biological connectedness, not their cultural connectedness. And that's central to Jungian psychology, right? and as it's been reproduced by pagan theologians and heathen theologians. So, for instance, like Stephen McNallen's metagenetic theory article is identical to Carl Jung's Wotan.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's the same idea. And then it's the blood and soil. And it's the same thing that gets put in the script of like the Vikings television show. Right? And you'd think like this is kind of glaring, but really we exist in this environment, so no one really considers it to be racist, really. But if you look at the suppositions, it completely is. And so, but this is all, but so the ideas of archetypes, these kinds of concepts, it's all over heathen theology, right? So I think some of these discussions we have to make are at that level, and some are at the level of mythic interpretation, say. So one of the things that racist heathens do, right, is that they interpret the myths. Let's see here. They interpret the myths and the differences between Jotnar and Vanir and Aesir. They see these as racial differences, right? And then the sort of and also humans and elves and dwarves, etc. They're all in separate pots and categories. Yet they can all interbreed. They all have the same culture. They all speak the same language, right? So.
Like they even honor like hospitality and weregild between each other.
Right. And the majority of the Aesir were not born Aesir. And even Odin was not born.
Oh, yeah.
And then a lot of inclusive heathens, on the other hand, they'll look at these differences and call them tribes. So these are just different, they're different cultural identities, right? And so that makes sense. But in the original laying down of these concepts, they were Aetia, which is more like clan. So it's even lower than tribe, right? It's basically family groupings. And so I see the heathen mythos as striving towards Frith, not striving away from law, right? So right-wing extremists see mythology as striving, like the trend is away from law and towards chaos, right? Whereas what I see is Odin always struggling to keep Frith, but eventually it fails, right? And to me, the tragedy of Ragnarok is that Frith has failed for an inclusive heathen, but for a racist heathen, it's a good thing because it allows you to reestablish law, right? So you're looking forward to Ragnarok, although it's horrible, it's a tragedy, but at least you'll be able to apply moral violence so that boom, you can reestablish the social order that you love and that you have in your mind, right?
It's not unlike rapture theology in
absolutely.
Christianity cool, Jesus comes down and lays waste with the sword, and then we get 1,000 years of God says everything's great. The end.
Yeah. So it's eschatological, an eschatological focus, right? Eschatological redemption, and this sort of eschatological redemption, I can't remember what they call it. It's got this crazy word like pan something or other. Anyways, it's a word that's only used for fascism, and it's an element of the ideology of fascism is this particular concept, right?
Yeah. This redemptive violence is being necessary.
Yeah, but it also has to be eschatological. It has to be. It has to end a time to create. Right. So even though it harkens back to an old one, what you're doing is using the past to create a future. Right. So I find these kinds of conversations interesting, and that's kind of the stuff that excites me, because we can say we're against right-wing extremist heathens, that's fine, but most of us aren't. We don't have like a lot of us might not even have any interactions with right-wing extremist heathens. So what do we do besides complaining about the other guy? What do we do about us, right? Because what we have to look at is what are the narratives of the right-wing extremists. What narratives do they share with people who are not heathens and maybe are not extreme, that bring them into extremism? We have to look at those narratives and say, where do we still participate in those narratives? right? So these are things like, to me, these are things like those examples of the myth, like trying to reconstruct a runology that hasn't been ripped off of Kabbalah by theosophists, that kind of stuff. Like, so that we have within inclusive heathenry much different narratives, and we already have some different narratives. So, for instance, there are elements of the Odinic and Odinist who still follow this 1950s sci-fi sort of Vril, the concept of Vril, magical energy, stave yoga, and all that stuff, right? There's still groups that are doing that, but they're essentially frozen in a past tradition. That's the tradition, the right-wing extremist tradition that emerged, from the esoteric groups of Germany, right? And then were reproduced outside of Germany during the 50s and 60s, right? So I sort of spun out to nothing there.
No worries.
but yeah, so that theological angle is always interesting to me. And I've been playing around with those sort of concepts actually since I started heathenry, because like I said, I knew about racist heathens before I knew about left-wing heathens. But when I met my first left-wing heathens, I was like, this is the thing for me. Because what it did was it started to introduce me to a relational ontology, a different way of being in the universe, which I found extremely productive, but also I felt it was a way to achieve anti-oppression and multicultural objectives for society as a whole, and those are values I hold very close. So,
Excellent. Well, it's been great having you on, and this has been an incredible conversation. Especially getting into more of the both like understanding how these nexuses of movements and ideas, as well as the way that particularly in the heathen community we can start working on our narratives. Well, not to start, but continue working on our narratives to fix this. Are there any last things you'd like to end on before we go?
Well, the main thing I want to end on is right-wing extremism is not somebody else's problem, in the sense that we have to be aware of it and we have to act against right-wing extremism when we can. But it also means that right-wing extremism exists within us, because right-wing extremists, it's not just people, it's not just symbols, it is the ideas that those people hold that creates right-wing extremism. It isn't the people. It isn't the organization they belong to. It is the idea, and it is the culture that they subscribe to, because it is the emotional reaction to that story and narrative that produces their behavior, right? So if we don't want our behaviors to be similar, we've got to also make sure that we don't think like they do or believe in any way like they do, because our emotional reactions will be similar. And if we have collective emotional reactions, who knows where our social movement may go, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This has been Austin Lawrence. Thank you again for being on for Streams of Resistance. And now at this point, I'm gonna.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This has been Austin Lawrence. Thank you again for being on for Streams of Resistance. This has been Ryan Smith at the Wayward Wanderer, now signing off. Lawrence, thank you again for being on for Streams of Resistance. And now at this point, I'm gonna.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This has been Austin Lawrence. Thank you again for being on for Streams of Resistance. This has been Ryan Smith at the Wayward Wanderer, now signing off. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to help support more work like this, then please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month gets you early access to podcast episodes, ad-free listening, monthly patrons-only live stream sessions with your host and author of The Way of Fire and Ice, Ryan Smith, and more. Please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. Thanks for listening.